We've been in this collection of messages called Born to Run. And Wes, I love this imagery that Wes has used as a runner, comparing that to our faith journey. And the first week he talked about how we can get back on our feet. And then he talked about how we can stay on our feet. And last week he talked about how we can finish on our feet. And today we're going to close out this collection of messages, and we're going to talk about the next step in our faith journey that really is, I feel like, something that the American church has failed to do for a very, very long time. Now, I don't look like it, but I did run at some point in my life. As a matter of fact, our football coaches made us participate in track events and even in track practice when we were in skill position. So I was a receiver in high school. I don't look like it now, but I was. At one point, I was a little bit faster. I really couldn't catch that well, but that's what they had me do. And so I did that. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to speed other people. I didn't have the speed, but I knew what I could do is I could beat them with my effort. And so I ended up doing distance runs in track. I did the 2-mile. But before I knew that, I didn't know that we had to run 4 miles every day for track practice. So I kind of hated my life for a little bit. At some point in my life, I did run. But I think a better representation of our faith journey is not actually a sprint or even a distance race. I would actually argue that it's more like a relay race. And with me tonight, I have a baton. Now, if you know anything about relay races, I'm sure you've seen them on the Olympics during the Summer Olympics. But this is what's used. They use the same things in middle school. They use the same things in high school and college and even in the Olympics. But here's the thing with a relay race. You run as a team. You win as a team. You lose as a team. Not only that, I think our faith in Jesus is very similar in that regard because, yes, your faith is your personal relationship with Jesus, but it's not meant to stay with you. It's meant to be passed along. And so tonight, as we dive into what I want to challenge us to do is passing on the baton. As we look into this, I want us to answer 3 questions for us this evening as we consider what it means to really pass the baton. But in a relay race, there's a critical moment. Because, again, there's nothing special about this. It's just anodized aluminum, but the only value this thing has is really what we give it. But in a relay race, if this touches the ground, that's it. Game over. There's a critical moment when this needs to be passed off from one person, from one runner to the next. There's actually it's a 20-meter zone with a 10-meter run-up for that transition period for the next runner. And there's so many things that can go wrong in that moment. If you drop the baton, you're disqualified. If you run out of your lane during the baton pass, you're disqualified. If you run out of the takeover zone without changing the baton, you're disqualified. If you cross the finish line without the baton, you are disqualified. So there's a lot of ways that this thing can go wrong. It seems so simple. But even people in the Olympics, you've seen people that they fail to make the handoff. They've made their life's work about running a race with their teammates, and they still tend to fail at times if they're not careful, because there isn't much room for error. Every step has to be timed perfectly, and every step has to be synchronized with your teammates. Now, I've never actually officially ran a relay race, but I did compete in speed skating growing up. Again, at one point in my life, I was a lot faster than I am now. But I did speed skating. Some of you are thinking ice speed skating. I did do that, but I also did roller inline speed skating. And I did relays. As a matter of fact, I went to nationals a couple times, mainly because of relays, and our team was successful there. But yes, those are similar in some ways, but they are different in others. But the premise stays the same. You run your leg of the race well, or you skate your leg of the race well, and you set your teammate up for success for their leg of the race. And so I want us to talk about that and how we can apply that to our faith tonight, because why is our faith in Jesus like a relay race? Those of us that have put our faith and our trust in Jesus may know like how much he can transform our life, how he can provide peace in the midst of craziness, the chaos of life that not many people can even understand. If we can even explain it to them, it just does not make sense to them. How we can fulfill the purpose in our lives, how we can quench the thirst of our soul. When the world is telling us that we need to be running to money, that's what's going to make us happy, or success, or that house, or that job, or the ideal family, that ideal spouse, for my kids to be successful in whatever they do. You see, the world tells us it's all these other things, and you can even look at some of the most successful in our society. You can look at the GOATs, like Tom Brady. Hate to admit it, but he's pretty great. That guy's won 7 Super Bowls. But even in a recent interview, he wants more. 1 wasn't enough, 3 wasn't enough, and even still today, there's that thirst that not even Super Bowls can satisfy. Same thing can be said about Michael Jordan. If you saw the documentary The Last Dance, he talks about, man, how I wish I could have just done one more, how I could have got my 7th. But even then, I don't think he would have been satisfied. But what a shame it is for us who we know what that thirst, that we know what can satisfy the thirst of our soul. What a shame it would be if we just kept that all to ourselves. That's what I want us to talk about tonight. Because our faith in Jesus, yes, it's our personal relationship, but that personal relationship is also meant to be shared and to pass on. When I first became a youth pastor, I used to think about how easy it was to relate to teenagers. And now that I look back on it, I think a lot of it I can attribute to I was just closer in proximity of age. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that it's a lot more difficult now than whenever I was in my early 20s. But yeah, I mean, we can attribute it to the difference in language, entertainment, or whatever the case may be, music. But what I've realized is I have to be that much more intentional in my approach now more as I get older. I think the same thing can be said about our interactions with our coworkers, our children. Because I think as I've been in this role for a while, one thing that I hear most from parents is it's really hard for me. I feel like I don't understand them. I feel like there's this big disconnect. But tonight, I want us to talk about the role that we all play in the spiritual formation of not just our lives, but the lives of the people around us. And I don't think anybody would disagree with this. Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 and 20. If you want to turn there, you can go ahead and do so. If not, it'll be up here on the screen. But this is what it says. This is Jesus talking to his disciples. He says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." We hear this and we're like, yeah, Taylor, duh. Like, we get that. We get that that's our job. But why is it so that the American church fails to do this so often? Instead of us like discipling the people around us, it's almost like we've made it like churches like going. If we go to church, we kind of get our daily dose of Jesus or our weekly dose of Jesus, or maybe even, depending on how often you go, maybe it's your monthly or your quarterly. We do the same thing with our kids and our teenagers and our spouses. Instead of treating Jesus like it's a relationship, we've treated it like it's a booster shot. I think somewhere along the way, we've gotten this mixed up. And again, as I've been a youth pastor for a while, at the very best, I've come to the realization that at the very best, I get to spend about 1 hour a week with teenagers. And that's if I'm lucky. And then, so if we want to expand that out, maybe that's 52 hours in a year, if we're lucky. That's not including holidays. That's also not including if their chemistry teacher gave them too much homework and they can't make it that night. That's not including if they got in trouble at home for smarting off. That's not including a number of other factors, like if they get sick. But again, 1 hour a week at best is what I have. And I don't say that as to say, like, man, you need to get your kids to church more often. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, if we're relying on the people that are here to be the model of what it looks like to have Jesus in your kids and your teenagers' lives, in your spouses' lives, in your coworkers' lives, in your neighbors' lives, that's not a whole lot of time. So how do we fix that? How do we as a church get better at, instead of doing this mediocre job of equipping our people to be the disciples, how do we help them be the spiritual leaders of their home? How do we do that? Because the best possible model for your kids and your teenagers and even your neighbors and your coworkers to have is the person that is going to be the living, walking Jesus that they have with them. More hours than what we would have here at Church Story. And that's you. How can we be better at equipping you to take the story of Jesus changing your life, how he's transformed your life, and taking that and sharing that with others? Because I think we've handicapped our people. I think we've handicapped to make them believe that just coming to church will satisfy that need. That if they make that decision at some point in their life to follow Jesus, that's it. That's all you need. You got baptized that one time. That's all they'll need. I think we as ministers of the gospel need to be better at this. Throughout the Bible, there's been many different great examples of what it looks like to pass the baton. We have Moses to Joshua. We have Naomi to Ruth. You'll see all these up here on the screen. You have Elijah to Elisha. You have David to Solomon. You have Elizabeth to Mary. You have Jesus to all of his disciples. And then you have Paul to Timothy. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these. But there's some of these that I do want us to draw our attention to. Because this list can go on and on. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the ones that came to my mind. There are so many more that we could probably find in the Bible if we took the time to actually look and go through it. But my personal favorite is actually the one at the very bottom. And Wes kind of touched on Paul and Timothy's relationship last week, but we'll be diving a little bit more into that tonight as well. But I told you that there's going to be 3 questions that I want us to consider tonight. And the first one is this: are you running your leg of the race? Are you running your leg of the race? Because if we're going to pass the baton of faith, we need to be better at being the example. We need to be better at being that model that we want the people around us to experience Jesus to have. Following Jesus is about a relationship. If you want to be an example for our kids and our teenagers, our spouses, our coworkers, even our parents, you have to run your leg of the race well. We hear it often that actions speak louder than words. And I think we all know that relationships are not what Disney makes it out to be. It's not like this thing that love at first sight. Relationships take time. They can be messy. They can be hard. They're difficult. But I think we've kind of sensationalized them in hopes that they'll be more instant. But no, they're cultivated over time and effort. If the people that you are wanting to know Jesus that are in your sphere of influence, if you want them to know, I think a question that I would like for us to ask ourselves even tonight is, man, are we living what we would want them to be like? If they saw us, even at our worst times, would they see Jesus? Man, I mean, I would say, sure, go for it, except whenever the Dallas Cowboys are playing. That's a version of Taylor that I don't think anybody should have to see. I'm surprised my TV even likes to come on sometimes. I feel like I hurt his feelings. But are you running your leg of the race? 1 John chapter 3, verse 18, if you want to turn there real quick, you don't have to. We're only going to be there for a short time, but it says, little children, let's not love with the word or with our tongue, but in deed and truth. There's a funny story. My mom loves to critique driving, particularly mine. And we were late all the time growing up. It never failed. And I mean, some of the times I'll even own it. Probably there were some times it was my fault. But my mom was just always habitually late to whatever we did. And so I could be ready early, but I know if my mom's going to have to take me, I'm probably going to be late. But it wasn't due to lack of effort in the car. We used to joke with my mom all the time that she should have been a NASCAR driver, weaving in and out of traffic like crazy. I mean, there were even times that there were always some close calls. My wife has to take an anxiety medication just before getting in the car with my mom because she can be a little crazy. But you know what's funny? The first person to critique how fast I'm going whenever I'm driving and she's in the passenger seat is who? My mom. Not only that, this happened just a couple months ago when I went to visit to help them move from one house to another. My mom was actually driving in front of me in a different vehicle, and she called me to tell me, Taylor, watch your speed. For real? Are you serious right now? But a humbling thought for all of us is that if we were the only amount of Jesus that people saw, that we interacted with, would they experience him through us? Or would it just be us? If we're going to say that we're followers of Jesus, I would have to say that at some point, even at our best, like they should see Jesus through us, either through our actions, not just our words. But I think oftentimes, like me, if you're like me, I hope you're like me. Even at our worst, it tends just to be us. Another humbling thought is if the people around us started to become us, would we be proud of that? The next thing I want us to consider when it comes to passing the baton of faith is, who am I passing it to? Who am I passing the baton to? I told you earlier that my favorite biblical example of discipleship is between Paul and Timothy, and there's a lot of things for that, and Wes actually went into some of the dynamics of Paul and Timothy last week, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. But before Paul was the man that we know who wrote over half the New Testament, he was a man that killed Christians, who persecuted them, had them imprisoned. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even a guy named Paul. He was actually a guy named Saul because his life was so different whenever he encountered Jesus that he had to change his name. That's a pretty crazy thought. And along his missionary journey, he met a young man in Ephesus named Timothy, a teenager, in fact, said to be between the ages of 13 and 16 whenever he encountered Paul. Timothy went on to join Paul on some of his missionary journeys throughout the Eastern Hemisphere, and so much so that he began to imitate Paul in a lot of ways by starting churches. And Timothy actually ended up becoming the pastor of the church in Ephesus. Turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 1 and 2, and this is what it says. You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is Christ Jesus. The things that you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. Man, I think whenever we read this, we don't understand the gravity of the words that Paul is telling to Timothy right here, because I know Wes mentioned last week that this was one of the last letters that Paul actually wrote, but I think it's interesting that 2 of the last 3 letters that Paul ever wrote before he died due to the oppression of the Roman Empire were written to Timothy. The third one was written to another person that Paul mentored. And so Paul was, whenever he's writing this is something that's so intimate between someone that he has shared his life with, given everything that he has to impart the wisdom, the greatest wisdom that he could ever give to Timothy. There's something in these words that I don't think we fully comprehend when he says that the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses. There's a lot of time, there's a lot of effort, there's probably a lot of tears, a lot of failures, maybe even some victories in those words. A lot of time and dedication that Paul put in to mentoring and discipling Timothy. Paul is also very much a sports fan. I don't know if you know that, but there's quite a few instances in the New Testament where he refers to sports and uses them as examples when it comes to teaching. And he does so again here in verse 5, just a couple verses down, and he says this, and if someone likewise competes as an athlete, he is not crowned as victor unless he competes according to the rules. Paul is basically here saying that you can't just be a part of the race. You can't just pick up your baton and say, hey, I made the decision to follow Jesus, and not pick this up daily. I think we're guilty of that a lot of times, myself included. We get comfortable. But if we want to run this race well and lead and be the model that Jesus wants us to be amongst the people that we have our sphere of influence over, it's going to require picking this up daily. But I think what makes it hard is we get discouraged. We get discouraged when our children, our teenagers, or the people that we care about, they choose to reject Jesus. These people that we desperately want to know him, maybe that's our spouse, our parents. I think we get discouraged in those moments, but I think it's in these moments that we need to realize that it's not us that saves people. Jesus already did that, in fact. We're just the messengers. We're just the ones that point them to the hope that has already been given to everyone that acknowledges it and believes it. But I think we get discouraged in that. The rejection, the hurt. I told you that at one point in my life I was a speed skater. And there was a time early on whenever I was learning how to do relays. And I was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade at this moment. But especially inline speed skating, it's such a niche sport. Not a whole lot of people participate in it. And so whenever you go to practices, if you're trying to get better at something, you might not actually be paired with somebody that's in your age group because, again, it's such an odd niche sport. And so whenever I was learning to do relays, I was paired with someone that was in their early 30s. And little did I know that whenever I was, now Nick, he ran his leg of the race well in practice. And then it was my turn to get to the transition zone, to get up fast enough to get in front of him. And in speed skating, instead of handing off a baton, you do something a little bit more hardcore. You actually physically push them to get them into position for their leg of the race. Now, as a 2nd or 3rd grader, I was smaller than most at that point in time. And I'd never gone that fast before, or at least not as fast as whenever he pushed me. And as soon as that moment happened, as soon as he pushed me, my legs came out from underneath me and I fell straight on my butt. And man, Nick felt really bad in that moment. But that moment makes me realize something even in relation to this. We can't force people into a relationship with Jesus. They have to be ready for it. That divine truth, that inherited truth that we teach and we empower our children, our coworkers, our friends, our spouses, even our parents to, has to become personal revelation. It can't be forced. And the next thing that I want us to consider tonight is the handoff. Will I make the handoff? You know, I was talking to one of our story team leaders in the youth a couple weeks ago after our middle school house party. Maybe actually it might have been our high school one. But I was talking to her about what sometimes how it feels like to be a youth pastor. A lot of times you feel like you're blindfolded and you're just throwing darts at a dartboard, really hoping that you actually just hit the target, anywhere on the target. It'd be great to hit a bullseye. Because a lot of times we'll have teenagers, again, for only a short amount of time, and then they go off to college or they move with their families after they graduate, and a lot of times you'll never really see or have the opportunity to see if that investment that you put in actually stuck. But again, it's not on us. That's where Jesus comes in. We're just the ones to be the messenger. We're the ones just to pass on the baton. Making the handoff requires something that I think we're not really great at. Turn with me to Philippians chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 9 really quickly. Paul is speaking to the church in Philippi, and this is what he says. As for the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. We've already seen how Paul is a really great example of someone that models discipleship, how he can pass the baton to others. Another great example of that was Jesus. He lived and modeled what it looks like for us to follow his example, but he did that for 3 years with the disciples. Can you imagine? I mean, hindsight's 20/20, but could you imagine looking at the disciples, or being one of the disciples, seeing all those miracles that he performed, hearing all those lessons that he taught? And it wasn't even until the moment that Jesus died and actually resurrected from the dead, showing that he can defeat sin and death, it was only then that they truly realized that he really was who he said he was. I say that because hindsight is 20/20. I feel like a lot of us would be like the disciples even now, knowing what we would know. Because again, I feel like even knowing what we know, we don't pick this up every single day. Some days, life gets too chaotic. It gets too hard. It doesn't fit into our schedule. I don't have time for that today. And we lay down our faith in Jesus and pick up ourselves. Go with our own wants, our own desires, our own dreams, instead of picking up what Jesus has in store for us. Because growing disciples does not happen in isolation. It does not happen by mistake. There's something that Wes actually said a couple of years ago. Maybe I was a teenager at the time. I can't remember. And I don't remember even if this is something that he thought of himself, but he said the moment that information and application come together, that's when transformation becomes real. It becomes a reality. You can't just know that Jesus is the Son of God without believing it and living it out each and every day. Again, it needs to be consistent. like a relay race. You have to practice. You have to pick it up daily. You have to take the knowledge of what you know and apply it to your performance for you to obtain that success. And the same thing is true about our faith. If we want to make disciples, if we want to pass on the baton of faith, it's a daily commitment. It's not a one-time decision and hoping that, man, because I made that decision whenever I was younger, hopefully that my spouse will do the same. Hopefully my kids will do the same. Hopefully my parents will do the same. Or anybody else that's in your life that you just deeply, deeply care about. So how do we pass on the baton of faith? 3 things real quickly. We have to be the example. You can't pass on something that you are not currently running with. You have to pick it up. And when you pick this up, you will get tired. You will stumble. But the beauty of it is you're going to have Jesus and your church family cheering you on every single step of the way. And you're going to learn your purpose. You're going to find your worth. You're going to find your value. You're going to learn to love others when it's hard. You're going to learn to serve whenever it's sacrificing something, when it's not convenient. You see, we need to model what it looks like when the world has us down, so that way when others that are around us, they can see why we have that peace. They can see why we have that joy, and they know where that comes from. Parents, if you desperately want your kids to run to Jesus, no matter the life circumstance, we have to model that for them. We all have to model that for them. The same for your coworker and your neighbor. Teenagers, just because you are young does not mean that you cannot make a difference. Time and time again, it's been miraculous what Jesus can do. I've seen teenagers put their faith in Jesus, and because of their faith in Jesus and what they've modeled and what Jesus has done in their lives, their teachers at school have put their faith in him because of that. Their parents at home have also done the same. So don't believe that you can't make a difference by living and running the race well. You have that ability too. We need to empower and teach. When they begin to ask, because our lives, as we begin to follow Jesus, our lives demand an explanation. And when they begin to ask for that explanation, we can teach them. We can empower them to do the same. You can't force that relationship. It's whenever that inherited truth and that inherited example becomes that personal revelation for them, Jesus begins to move. And he begins to move in big ways. If you're a teenager and you want your parents to come to church, keep running your leg of the race well. Keep picking this up daily. Keep modeling it after for them. And once they begin to see the change in you, then they'll start asking questions. I mean, there's got to be something to this Jesus thing. The same thing for adults. If you want your coworkers around you, you know they desperately need Jesus. Continue to model that for them. And whenever your life demands an explanation, they'll begin to ask. The last thing that we need to do, we need to have some consistency. When it comes to handing off the baton of faith, it's not a one-time thing. I feel like sometimes we feel like there's like this quota. Man, my kids are doing great. I've lived my life well. My kids have grown up and they love Jesus. That's it. I'm done. No, God's not done with you yet. Because you see, we don't stop making disciples until God tells us our time is up and he calls us home. Over the years, I've asked many adults to step in, to serve, and to volunteer and invest their time into students. And the biggest hesitation they have is, man, I can't relate to them. The best thing that you have to relate to them is Jesus transformed your life. And whenever you begin to serve, whether it's in youth, or it's in kids, or even community engagement. You just have to want God to transform their life too. God has given you a beautiful and unique story for you to share with others. So let's share that. You have the ability to make a difference, not just one time, consistently. Because you were born to run, but you've been purposed to pass the baton. Invest in the people that God has put on your heart and put in your sphere of influence. Wes said it last week that we're all ministers. It's not just the people that are up here on the stage. It's not just us. And it's not supposed to be easy. That's why we have our church family here. That's why we have each other. That's what it means to be a Christian. We are of Christ as one body. You know, it's funny. He's already shown us what it looks like to live out and lead that really, really well. The problem is we can't do that without him. We can't do that without him. Let's follow his example. He's literally shown us how, but we can't do it without him. We need Jesus because he's the one that transforms lives. It's not us. It's not the words that I say. It's not the words that we can say. It's through the words Jesus moves mountains. He breaks down walls and transforms lives. We're about to sing a song. It's called More Like Jesus. And I want us in this room to make that our prayer. Because if we really want to make a difference in the world around us, and we want our neighbors, our parents, our friends, our kids, our teenagers to be the follower of Jesus that maybe some of us are in this room, man, we need less of us and more of him. I want to invite you all to go ahead and stand. God, we're thankful for tonight. We're thankful that you're bigger and you're stronger than anything that we're ever going to face. We're thankful that it's not all on us to go out and make disciples. You've showed us and you've modeled for us what that looks like, and you've done that so well, and you've given us so many different people throughout the history that we can refer to in Scripture that have also done the same. God, continue to bring to mind the people that are in our lives that we need to pass the baton to. Help us lead by example. Help us teach and empower. And help us model that consistently, time and time and time again. But we can't do that without you. And so at this time, we make this song our prayer. We give this time to you.